like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is titled Engaging Your Local Political Representative, and it will be presented by Ryan Clark of Advocacy Solutions. In this webinar, you will learn the skills required to have effective in-person meetings with decision makers, including the development of your personal stories, the step-by-step process of getting a meeting with government officials, preparing for the meeting, conducting that meeting, and following up to ensure maximum impact, and most important, the pitfalls to be avoided to ensure substantive outcomes when meeting with decision makers. That just means you want to make sure something's going to happen after your meeting. You never go in there without something to ask for. Ryan Clark, our presenter today, is committed to providing a voice to organizations and individuals through the development and implementation of impactful advocacy strategies. He's hosted many successful webinars with CCSN, helping cancer survivors, patients, and caregivers, and everyone else in the community to successfully advocate in their own communities. During the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions during an interactive question and answer session. Please note on the right-hand bottom of your screen, there's a little box that you can type in to ask questions, and you can type in at any time, and Ryan will catch up with the questions towards the end of the webinar. For those of you who haven't attended an earlier webinar, this webinar is hosted by the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. At CCSN, we work with patients, survivors, families, partner groups, and sponsors on collaborative action to identify and remove barriers to optional patient care, to ensure access to education and action opportunities, and survivor involvement in healthcare decision-making, and to support evidence-based research on ways to promote equal access to early diagnosis, timely treatment, and excellence in follow-up care. If you'd like to learn more about CCSN, please visit our website at www.survivornet.ca. This webinar will be available online tomorrow. There'll be a full video on YouTube, as well as slides which will be on our SlideShare account, and links to both will be sent out tomorrow afternoon. Finally, we'd like to thank Novartis, Merck, and Janssen for their generous support of this webinar series. Now, over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Mona. I hope everybody can hear me okay, and I appreciate the opportunity to present to you this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. So this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'd like to cover off three basic areas. First, a very quick review of how to develop an effective advocacy plan or strategy. Secondly, we'll go over how to tell your personal story, either as a patient or caregiver or loved one, or speak of your personal experience if, for example, you're a volunteer, a staff person, or a healthcare professional. And finally, we'll spend the bulk of our time reviewing how to advocate in person from start to finish, as Mona just outlined a moment ago. And just a reminder that while I'll be concentrating my comments on advocating to government, because in any advocacy activity you need what we call a target, who is the person or what is the entity that can bring about the change that you require. The concepts that I'll be discussing work equally as well, irrespective of who you are advocating to. Whether you're advocating to your child's teacher, your spouse's physician, it doesn't really matter. The principles are exactly the same. So how to develop an effective advocacy plan. Again, this is just a quick overview. It's a much larger presentation. I go into a lot of detail, but again, I want to go through this to lay the foundation for the rest of the presentation coming up. So this is a three-step process that you, as an individual or as part of an organization, can start to do right away to create an actual advocacy plan that you can then implement in support of your issues. So key message development, development of your tools, and then development of your one ask. And I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail right now. So key message development. We talked first about identification. And this requires you to, as it says, be able to take an array of information and distill it down to its simplest form. And as it says, you need to be able to separate fact from fiction. And when you're advocating on behalf of a group, and this is a very important point, you need to be able to reach consensus around what it is that you want to say around your issue. And certainly sometimes that can be challenging. You need to frame your issues in the context of your key messages, and that's because many issues can be very broad and complicated and multi-layered. So when we talk about framing an issue, we're really referring to determining which aspects of the issue you want to focus on and therefore build your key messages around. When I work with organizations to develop key messages, I have a bit of a template or a roadmap that I typically use. The first key message is often answers the question, what is the problem, or a part of the problem? What is the issue? What are we here to talk about? The second key message often will address what is the impact of the problem. Just because you've told a decision maker that you have a problem doesn't mean they're going to feel compelled to do anything. You have to explain the impact of the problem, and of course, preferably the impact from their perspective. And then the final key message, number 3, is often what would it or what could it look like if the problem were resolved? And that final key message serves then as the bridge to your ask, which we'll talk about in a moment. So what's the problem? What's the impact of the problem? And then what it would look like, what could it look like if we resolve the problem? And then a bridge over, as I said. Second step is your advocacy tools. This is the means of delivering the message. Once you've got your 3 key messages, this represents the core of any effective advocacy strategy. Anything that you have or produce that may be used to communicate with people is a potential tool. And it includes things like letters, in-person meetings, which we're going to be talking about today, petitions, postcards, social networking tools. Any of those types of things are, as I said, potential tools. When we talk about advocacy, we boil it down even more so to these 3 words on the slide: educate, demonstrate, advocate. The first thing you need to do if you're going to advocate to anybody about anything is you need to educate them about your issue. And you do that typically through your key messages, your 3 key messages we just talked about. The second thing you need to do is to demonstrate why your issue is important. Now, this is where most people make a fundamental mistake. They talk about how important their issue is to them without recognizing that from the decision maker's perspective, it's really about how important the issue is from their perspective. And so you can't just talk about why it's important for you, why it's important for your organization. You need to be able to frame it such that you can say, this is why it should be important to you, decision maker. This is why it must be important to you, decision maker. That's demonstrating the importance of the issue from their perspective. And then finally, advocate. That's your one ask, which we will get to right now. So educate, demonstrate, advocate, 3 steps. Can't do them out of order. You can't skip a step. That's basically it. And then finally, your one ask, because you're going to ask for the one thing you need and not a list of what you want. I'll say that again. You must ask for the one thing you need and not a list of what you want. As I say to people I work with, advocacy is not Christmas. It's not an opportunity to ask for everything you've ever wanted from this decision maker. It's one thing at a time. Now, you may need more than one thing. That's not my point. But you can only ask for, or should only ask for, one thing at a time. And finally on this slide, and this is very important, your ask needs to be tangible. You don't ask for support, because support is not a thing. You don't ask for help, because help is not a thing. You have to ask for something tangible. So for example, if you were meeting with your provincial representative, you might ask that person to write a letter on your behalf to the Minister of Health outlining 3 issues. That's tangible. It's a thing. It's an ask. It's a letter. You can see it. You can feel it. And so your ask always needs to be tangible, and I cannot emphasize that enough. So why meet with your local member of parliament or provincial representative? Well, in addition to what I have presented up there on the slide, it's also one of the most impactful means of delivering your 3 key messages and your one ask, which I just reviewed. It says there, healthcare is a provincial matter, and so you're likely to want to bring it forward to your provincial member of parliament. You'll need to build relationships with that person, or should build a relationship with that person if you're going to be advocating to them, certainly with any kind of frequency. And face-to-face meetings, of all of the different tools that one can use, face-to-face meetings are largely regarded as one of the most impactful tools because of that physical presence that you have in front of somebody. And there's no substitute for that in most other tools you have. Although, let me emphasize, it doesn't mean that it is the only tool, and it doesn't mean that it's the tool that will solve all of your problems, but certainly it's one that typically needs to be incorporated into any substantive advocacy effort. So let's start from the beginning, preparing for the meeting. These are the first steps to preparing for your meeting with your elected representative. In addition to your 3 key messages and your 1 ask, you need to determine who will be attending the meeting. One of the typical rules that we use is this idea of never going alone. Depending on the circumstances, it could be a number of people or different combinations of people, but I always emphasize it's very important that you don't go alone. And it's for a very simple reason. And that is that 2 sets of eyes and 2 sets of ears are better than 1 set of eyes or 1 set of ears. I have debriefed with 2 people who have been in the meeting after the meeting, and from one person I've heard it was a wonderful meeting, she was very engaged, I think it went really well, and I've heard from the other person who was in the same meeting, no, I didn't think she was very engaged, she didn't seem to pay attention much at all, and she didn't commit to doing anything. Same meeting, 2 very different perspectives. If only one of those people had gone into the meeting, you would only have received one of those perspectives. And of course, truth is it's probably somewhere in the middle. But the point is that when you have more than one person, you're able to gather several different perspectives, which can be very valuable. The other basic rule that we try to always adhere to is that however many people are in the meeting, if it's only two, or if it's more, somebody has to share their personal story. Somebody has to talk about how the issue that you were there to talk about has impacted them or their family or their organization or that sort of thing. It's very, very important. And we'll be talking about personal stories in a moment. Okay? And furthermore, especially if you're meeting with a politician, I like to advise that at least one person must be a patient as opposed to a caregiver or a loved one. But if at all possible, to have an actual patient there who can speak about these issues from their perspective by saying, I'm impacted in a certain way, is also something that we strive for. So, telling your personal story. I'm going to review how to tell your personal story in an in-person meeting with a decision maker, because that's the focus today. This decision maker could be anybody, depending on the issue that you're advocating for. But in this case, again, I'm going to use politicians as an example, as opposed to a bureaucrat or something like that in government. But I'm going to assume that you have that you're in front of a politician, an elected representative, since that's our theme. Although everybody has a personal story to tell or a personal experience to share, at a minimum, the patient or caregiver present in the meeting will share theirs with the decision maker, as I just said before. So what is a personal story? Well, as it says there, it's really to represent a summary about what has happened to you as a result of the issue that you have before them. And let me pause there for a second and emphasize this, because it's very important. If you are there to talk about, for example, some kind of treatment option or something like that, or some kind of medication or some kind of intervention like that, and that's the theme of your meeting, your personal story, or the emphasis of your personal story, has to reflect that issue. So in other words, you wouldn't tell a personal story that talked all about the fact that you couldn't get a timely diagnosis. That may be part of your personal story, and you can certainly say, I had a very difficult time getting a timely diagnosis, but that shouldn't be the main theme of what it is that you're there to talk about, because that's not the issue. Early diagnosis isn't the issue. It's access to treatment is the issue. So you need to frame your personal story or modify your personal story to really ensure that it's reflective of the issue that you that you are there to discuss. So in addition to what's on the slide there, let me add just a few more pieces around your personal story. First of all, it's personal, and that might seem obvious because it's called a personal story. But what I mean by that is that it's about you, not everybody around you, and therefore you need to use the words I and me and my and that kind of thing. This can be a real challenge for some people, especially those people who are not used to talking about themselves. It can be very unnatural for some people to talk about themselves and their needs and their concerns and their experience, and I understand that. But you have to. You have to if it's going to be personal, because a personal story can't be all about how everybody else was affected except for you. You're simply telling their personal story from your perspective and not yours. Now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean that your personal story can't include other people. Of course it will. But it really needs to primarily focus on you and your journey to get to this point. Your personal story is really very important in the context of advocacy. It's what fuels the logic of your key messages in your one ask that I talked about before. It really underpins the logic of your key messages in your one ask. And finally, it's supposed to be emotional. It's supposed to be compelling, but it's also supposed to be believable. So you don't ever need to feel the need to exaggerate your personal story. Your personal story is what it is. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be the truth. But it's also supposed to be emotional. And by the way, emotional doesn't mean sad. Emotional can mean happy and sad and optimistic and pessimistic and worried and hopeful and all the range of emotions that we as people feel. And it should reflect the range of emotions that people feel. Again, sometimes people equate emotion to sadness or despair, and I don't mean that at all. As I said, it's the full range that you want to get across. So when you tell your personal story, you really got two choices. You may have never thought of it this way, but you really do have two essential choices. You can either do a summary of your entire personal story as it pertains to the issue. Again, back to what I said a moment ago, you always have to focus at least somewhat on that issue at hand. Or you can tell a portion of your story that focuses on one or two aspects of the issue. So you don't tell your whole story, you just tell a segment of your story, again, that connects into your the issue that you're there to talk about. I don't know how many of you have ever written out your personal story as it relates to any aspect of your lives, but you need to do that if you're going to be a patient advocate. It is essential. If you're going to do this and you're going to do this well, you have got to have a written version of your personal story. It's essential because we all forget things. It's an ongoing story that you'll always be adding to, and you're going to need to create versions of your story, as I just said a moment ago. It's also essential because, and I often get this question, if I go to all of this effort to create my personal story, and even if, as it says there, I create a sort of a summarized version of it, a 5-minute version of it, either as a summary of the whole thing or as a portion of what I want to talk about, am I allowed to read it? And the answer is yes, of course you are. I tell people that, advocacy is not a test. Nobody's marking you. Nobody is judging you on how you do this or how well you do it or anything like that. You just need to be yourself. And I will often advise people that if you've put in the time to create your personal story, you've chosen the words right and all the rest of it carefully, and you want to read it, that's fine. You can certainly go ahead and read it. There's no issue there. Some people wouldn't want to read it. They would rather just speak to it, and that's okay too. But always remember that one of the benefits of reading something like this is that it will get the decision maker's attention because of the time that you've put into it. And if you do read it, you won't forget anything. It's right there. And I've actually become quite a big proponent of people reading their stories. Again, I know it's not for everybody. I'm not suggesting you have to do it, but I've actually become quite a proponent of it. I think it works extremely well. So again, this is all behind closed doors in the context of a meeting. This is not in public. This is not in the media or anything like that. You don't have to be perfect at it to be effective. and sometimes reading can be the best way to communicate. There are some essential elements I think you're going to want to include in your entire personal story. I'm referring now to the one that hopefully you'll sit down and actually create in writing and have it as a resource to be able to use when you have meetings. But basically, you want to establish sort of your name, age, where you live, or occupation, former occupation, and family. And these first two bullets are really just meant to kind of establish a baseline of, you know, I am just a person with a family or whatever, and basically this is how I got to this place in my life where, and then the diagnosis kind of thing. And it may not be diagnosis, it could be something else, but usually we use diagnosis as the turning point or as the trigger point to say, I was living my life up until this moment, and then diagnosis. Now, some diseases people are born with, so there is no diagnosis trigger, that kind of thing. That's obviously a bit of a different personal story. But for most people, that's usually what it is. And then upon diagnosis, then you really kind of shift the personal story to incorporating what it's been like living with a particular disease, for example. So the challenges that have been faced by you, and then particularly around the relevant issue, again, that you're there to talk about, and what you believe government needs to do to help you and to help others. And again, back to the point I made a moment ago, at every point in the story, you need to talk about how you felt. You need to relay that emotion. You need to make it very clear. At this moment, you know, this was my reaction when I was diagnosed. And this is how I felt, you know, 2 months later, 5 months later, that kind of thing. And again, it's the full range of emotions. If you can do that effectively, you will have absolutely connected with the decision maker, particularly a politician, because it can be very, very powerful, I think, to speak in those types of terms. So let's go back now to the in-person meeting slides and continue on now that we've talked about having your personal story and how important it is in that context. So you need to decide going into your meeting, I'm not going to give up until I get my meeting. So you need to be realistic about who you need to meet with. Just a word on elected representatives, federal, your MP, or your provincial elected representatives. You are absolutely entitled to meet with these people. Again, I often will come across people who say, well, I don't want to inconvenience them. I don't know if anybody would want to meet with me. I don't know if my issue is important. And not only is your issue important, and not only are you entitled to meet with your elected representative, it's a federal issue with your MP, and if it's a provincial issue with your member of provincial parliament, but they are obligated to represent you. They have to represent you. That's their job. And so you are absolutely entitled to meet with them. Now, that doesn't mean you're entitled to meet with them anytime, anywhere, about anything, and that sort of thing. But you do have a fundamental entitlement, if I can put it that way, for them to engage you and in turn to represent your interest to that level of government, depending on what the issue is. So what I usually advise people to do is once you've decided that you want to meet with your elected representative, let's assume it's a provincial representative, if it's healthcare, then I often advise people to call first on the telephone, which might seem a little odd, but I suggest that people call first. And I'm suggesting you call the constituency office, so the local office of your elected representative. Tell them who you are, tell them that you want to meet, and tell them just very briefly a little bit about what the issue is. Now, you'll probably be asked to send something in writing, which is fine. So you should have a meeting request ready to go, an email or whatever it is. And even while you're on the telephone, for example, with the constituency assistant, you can say, absolutely, I've got this email ready to go. If you can give me your email address, I will type it in and I will send it to you right now. And in fact, I'll wait on the line until I'm sure that you have it, because it's very important to me to make sure that you get this call, or that you get this email request. And then they can tell you, oh yes, I got your email request, and that's perfect. Just doing that little thing will distinguish you from a lot of people who reach out to their provincial members or elected members. Many times people will call the constituency office, they'll be told that they have to put something in writing, and then they won't bother. And so when you demonstrate to the person on the other end of the phone that you're serious about this and the way you're approaching it, it will have an impact on them, which is positive for you because it will get your issue to the top of the pile, and they'll recognize that essentially you know what you're doing. The next thing is, after you've sent that email request in, you have to follow up, follow up, follow up. If you want a meeting with somebody, you need to get it. I told you that they were obligated to meet with you, and that is true. But that doesn't mean that all of them fulfill their obligation. Therefore, you need to follow up, sometimes relentlessly, in order to get the meeting. You can't wait for them to call you back. They may never call you back. So it's your responsibility. And finally, just on this slide, if you're offered a chance to meet with somebody else, so for example, somebody else in their constituency office, a policy advisor, or whoever it may be, depending on the circumstances, but not the actual elected member themselves. I think it's fine to take the meeting, but you have to make it very clear to everybody involved that this is not meant as an alternative or as a substitute for meeting with your decision maker, with the decision maker, him or herself. I will often say, or I'll often suggest that you use a meeting with somebody else as practice to get better at this kind of work, but that you always tell the person you're meeting with, it's been great, I'm happy to meet with you and go through this, but I need to also meet directly with my elected representative. She's the person who represents me, for example, at Queen's Park or in Ottawa or wherever it may be, and that's the person I need to meet with. So in addition to this meeting, I insist that at some future date, I get to meet with the actual elected representative themselves. Before the meeting, sending material ahead of time. Sometimes it's advisable to send materials ahead of time. However, if you do send material ahead of time, especially to a politician, you have to assume that they may not have read the material, but that in some cases, a bureaucrat maybe would have read the material and prepared a briefing note for that person. This is particularly applicable if you're meeting with a member who is in cabinet, for example, because they'll have access to a bureaucracy that can prepare these kinds of things. Although even backbenchers and opposition members also have resources that allow staff to prepare briefing notes for them and summary material. If you do decide to send material ahead of time, it should be brief, simple, delivering your 3 key messages we talked about earlier. You have to remember that in the context of this kind of activity, you are competing with every other person and organization that that person is meeting with. That day, that week, that month, whatever it may be. So you've got to be impactful, and that's challenging. It's challenging to stand out from the crowd, but it's really the effort that you need to make to be effective at this kind of work. You also need to know who the participants are in the meeting before you go in there. Ideally, you will ask and say, who will be attending the meeting with you? If it's your local representative, will they be bringing a staff person with them, for example? But who's coming with them? And also the length of the meeting. A lot of people never confirm how long the meeting is scheduled for. They just say, well, I have a meeting, it's great, it's next Thursday, it's at 2 o'clock, I show up at 2 o'clock, and you have no idea how long it's for. I will tell you that most meetings are usually scheduled for 30 minutes, which is fine. But always remember, if you have a 30-minute meeting, you need to prepare for a 20-minute meeting. Assume they're going to come late, assume they have to leave early. Because if you time everything down to 30 minutes, you might be in trouble when it comes to trying to finish up. Who should attend the meeting? The number of people you bring to your meeting should reflect to some extent the number of people on the other side. Now again, when we're talking about meeting with a political representative at the local level, it's usually just yourself, one other person, and them either alone or maybe with a staff person. So it's really not all that complicated. But at other times, it can get more complicated. And if, for example, the person that you're meeting with is told you that they're bringing 5 people, then you should try to bring more than 2 people. There should be some measure of balance. And by the same token, if they're bringing 2 people, you don't want to show up with 6 people because then that looks uneven kind of thing. So just make sure that there's some some measure of balance there. But as I said, in most cases, that shouldn't be an issue. Okay. Make sure that everyone has a reason for being there. And one of those reasons should be to take notes. Somebody should always be taking notes as to what's happening, not just what's being said, but even, for example, what the body language is telling you, or people's facial expressions, or how somebody spent the entire time on their iPhone, not even looking up, or whatever it may be, or somebody else was constantly glancing at their watch. These are the kinds of things that you may want, that you need to pick up as your as part of the observational element of a meeting. But my point is that somebody needs to be watching for that and taking note of it. Also, make sure that everybody knows why they're there. Make sure that everybody who attends, and again, it may just be the two of you, but everybody knows why they're there and what the role is that they're not just the role that they're supposed to play, but what is the subject matter that you are there to discuss. And let me give you an example just to make this a little clear. I was in a meeting when I used to work in government. I was in a meeting, and it was just myself and the minister that I worked for, and two gentlemen came in. And they were there actually not to meet with him as the MPP, but they were there to meet with him as the minister, which is fine. But they happen to live in his riding. They happen to live in his constituency. And so just as we were getting underway, the one person said to the minister, I know we're here to talk about this other issue, but I wanted to mention something about this stop sign at the end of my street. Now, a couple things. First of all, stop sign has nothing to do with the provincial government, but aside from that, that's not what they were there to talk about. They weren't there to talk about a stop sign. They were there to talk about another ministerial issue, not a local issue. And yet, that meeting got so sidetracked because they were there to talk about a stop sign that they went completely off message. They really achieved not much of anything at all. And at the end of it, all they really learned is that the minister I worked for could talk about stop signs for about 20 minutes. So my point being that don't ever do that to anybody. Don't ever ambush a meeting like that on a different topic or on a different issue area. Agree that you're there to talk about one thing or one particular issue. If you have another issue that you want to talk to that particular member about, that's fine, but you can do that at another time, not in the context of that particular meeting. And just make sure that everybody knows why they're there. And then on this slide, you'll notice the fourth bullet. It says one combination, patient organization, physician, and then patient caregiver. In the context of advocacy with respect to healthcare, this is a really good combination that we've used on a number of different occasions. I'm not saying you have to use that combination, but it's a combination that I particularly like, and I'll tell you why. When you have a representative of a patient organization, a physician or other healthcare professional, and a patient or caregiver, and you're meeting with somebody, there's really nowhere for them to hide, as I like to describe it. No matter what the issue is that you want to talk about, those three interests or those three perspectives can represent and speak to any different angle. So for example, if the member wants to talk about the broader impact of the disease state across the province, the patient organization can obviously talk about that. If the person wants to talk about the direct impact on individual patients and caregivers, well, that story can be told by the patient and the caregiver, or just the patient who is there. And finally, if there are any clinical issues, not that politicians usually talk about clinical issues, but if there's any clinical content or there's anything to do with the evidence that is going to be brought up, then the physician or the healthcare professional can speak to that as well. So I really like this combination depending on the circumstances, and it's something that you should potentially keep in mind. At the meeting. So the good news is you've got your three key messages. You've got the right combination of people in front of the decision maker you need to see, and you're prepared. The bad news is you've got really just 1 minute to make an impact here. to essentially say who you are, who you represent, if in fact you represent anybody other than yourself, why you're there, what you need this decision maker to do for you and how, and what you can offer in return. If you do that, this is called the 1-minute rule. And the 1-minute rule is when you basically sit down and you answer all of these questions in 1 minute kind of thing. If you do this, you will have distinguished yourself from 99 out of 100 external people that person will ever meet with, because most of us don't communicate this way. We don't get to the point quickly, and we don't focus the way we should in this context. If you don't do this, especially to a politician, they'll still be there in body, they'll still be there in person, but you will risk their mind wandering off and going somewhere else and really not being completely engaged in what it is that you're trying to achieve. So I strongly recommend that you try to use the 1-minute rule if at all possible. The final point there around the 1-minute rule, the what you can offer in return, sometimes there are circumstances in which you can offer something in return. There are other circumstances where you can't. I just put that in as a placeholder, and where you can address that kind of issue, or that kind of opportunity, I should say, you certainly should. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on presentations on this particular slide, and certainly in the context of PowerPoint. But I'm often asked, when do you use PowerPoint slides? In most cases, when it's what I'll call a personal meeting, you as an individual patient caregiver meeting with your local provincial representative about an issue that is affecting you on a personal level, you don't need to use PowerPoint presentations. You don't need to do anything like that. You may want to bring in something on a piece of paper just to keep them focused, but you probably don't need to use presentations. You generally do, though, when under the following circumstances. If the issue is complicated, you may want to use it. If you do not know any of the people that you're meeting with for some particular reason, PowerPoint can be effective. If there's going to be a lot of people in attendance, I usually say if there's going to be 6 or more people in attendance, PowerPoint can be a way to get people sort of focused on something in the meeting itself. And if any of the people that you're meeting with, are bureaucrats. Again, this discussion is focused more on your political representative, but if you are meeting with a bureaucrat, PowerPoint is usually the way to go. But as I said, if you're not going to use a PowerPoint presentation, which in most cases you won't, you may want to bring something along ahead of time, or to the meeting, I should say, so that there's something for them to focus on paper, that kind of thing. Just continuing on with presentations themselves, you need to be results or resolution focused, not complaints focused. You're going to talk about why things need to change around your issue, but you don't want to end there like most people do or most groups do. You want to present solutions. You want to try to present a solution to your issue, not just, I have a problem, over to you kind of thing to solve. You want to talk about solutions in a way that hopefully will lead to something productive. I talked about roles and responsibilities before in terms of people being in meetings. Well, one of the key roles is to watch the time. I told you if you have a 30-minute meeting, you need to prepare for a 20-minute meeting. Watching the time is very important. 30 minutes will fly by. You'll feel like you really haven't accomplished much of anything, but you can accomplish a great deal in that time if you are focused, but watching the time is important. You also need to assign somebody to pull the meeting back if it goes off the rails. I tell people, this is your meeting. This isn't your elected representative's meeting. This is your meeting. You requested the meeting. You need to control it. You need to manage it. And one of the ways to manage it is to make sure that nobody gets off on a tangent. Nobody starts talking about things that aren't important, that aren't part of the issue that you're there to discuss. Because it's eating into your time, and you need all the time you can get, particularly if you only have 30 minutes kind of thing. The next 3 slides are just some examples from the CCSN website regarding the most recent provincial election in Manitoba, and it's just an example of some of the resources that are online through the organization. I think that can be very beneficial for people. So you can see there that there's a list of election campaigns that CCSN prepares materials to allow people to engage, in this particular case with candidates. The most recent one, as it says there, is from April of 2016. And so in this particular case, there's CCSN is asking questions of the actual leaders themselves at both the provincial, so actual party leaders as part of that process, as you can see there. But then they also prepared materials for individuals to ask candidates at the local level, kind of thing. And this is the kind of material that the organization uses as an adjunct to this idea of meeting in person. So sending this kind of material out to a candidate can also result, for example, in a face-to-face meeting. We've been talking about elected representatives, but of course, you can also have meetings with candidates in the context of an election. It can be very, very impactful around trying to get a measure of engagement, because after all, one of them presumably will be elected after the provincial election. So just continuing on here, effective advocacy is about presenting, listening, and responding. If you hear yourself talking continuously, you need to essentially stop talking. If you don't, you're letting the decision maker get away with not having to say anything, and therefore not address your 3 key messages or your 1 ask. So it's not about how much you can talk. It's very much a matter of ensuring that you get across what you need to get across, and that you then engage in a dialogue. And in that context too, don't be afraid to ask questions. If something isn't clear to you, just say, I don't know, I'm not understanding it. I'm not following what it is that you're trying to say. Can you please clarify that for me? I've been in so many meetings, particularly when I was in government, where I know people didn't understand what in my case, the minister was saying, but they didn't ask questions. They didn't seek clarification, and that's a shame, because you absolutely should do that. Never, ever hesitate to ask questions. I told you a moment ago about this idea of this combination of a healthcare professional, a patient organization, and a patient and caregiver being in a meeting again, and now I've just introduced you to this idea of the different roles. And over the course of 30 minutes, this is an idea of the kind of thing that you can look at in terms of a sample agenda. So introductions and delivery of the key messages kind of thing, 5 minutes. Healthcare professional might speak for 5 minutes. And the patient organization, the patient and caregiver, that 5 minutes is about delivering a personal story, for example. And then it leaves about 10 minutes for discussion. And you have to modify this accordingly depending on the circumstances. So again, this is strictly a sample for you. The physician will often explain what the disease is and the impact that the issue has on her patients. So she'll talk about her personal experience as a clinician to the politician, preferably in lay terms so the politician can understand it. The patient organization will often explain what they do for patients and the change they are advocating for. Then, as I said, the patient caregiver story comes in. And ideally, in a perfect world, the patient will be the patient of the physician who is present, and all of them, both of them, will be members of the patient organization. And therefore, everybody's coordinated, everybody's on the same page, and again, you present a united front to this decision maker. After the meeting, you need to try to stay top of mind, as I said earlier, to the people that you're advocating to, and that can be very challenging. But one way to do that is to show them that you are doing everything you can do to help yourself or your issues and them or their priorities, kind of thing. Contrary to popular belief, governments particularly like helping those who help themselves because it's less work for them. Governments will always help people who can't help themselves. That is certainly a key part of their job or their role in our system, in our society. But in the context of advocacy, you should know that decision makers find it much more appealing when somebody comes in and says, here's what I'm doing to affect change around this issue. This is the role that I'm playing. This is the role the patient group is playing. But we need you to join us in this work. Because if you join us, we believe we can achieve the outcome ultimately responsible, that's the best outcome that we're responsible for at the end of the day. And even on a personal level, you can do that. You can go to your elected representative and you can say, this is what I've been doing to help myself, but I need you to do this one piece in order to make sure that it all comes together. That's much more appealing than somebody who simply walks into a meeting and says, I need you to help me, I don't know what to do, kind of thing. And then just to close off, a couple of more slides. Here's some tips around advocating to politicians for your consideration. I often describe it, don't ever try to actually do this, but I often describe it as climbing two ladders simultaneously. And this is particularly when you're talking about advocating to both politicians and to bureaucrats. You want to make sure that if you're advocating to politicians, you don't get too far up the ladder at the same time that you may be advocating to a group of bureaucrats, for example. Now, again, I realize this may not be applicable for individuals who are usually just engaging people on the political side of the equation, but for any organization or for anybody who does this at a larger level, you may find yourself advocating to both politicians and bureaucrats, and so that's why I use that analogy of saying that you don't want to get too far up or down the ladder with either side, because you want to make sure that you're engaging both simultaneously. And finally, advocating in person in terms of what not to do. These are just some, I suppose, more for your entertainment than anything else, but everything on this slide happened to me when I worked in government. I was threatened. It doesn't work, by the way. There's only one government in power in any jurisdiction at any one time, so I wouldn't suggest that you try to threaten anybody, but people do it. You would be surprised. And so I don't recommend that, but also some of the other points that I have there, which perhaps are more relevant. You want to make sure that if you make an appointment with somebody, that you know why you're there. There's a context, there's a message. You want to make sure you know why you're meeting with that particular person, and not just somebody for the sake of meeting with somebody. And of course, you never want to do a technical presentation to somebody who doesn't have the background or the experience or the education or training to understand what it is that you're talking about. So ultimately, it's up to you to decide how important your issues will be from a health policy perspective in Canada. It's not predetermined. I tell people it's really up to you to figure out and to decide how important it's going to be. And then in that context, you want to make sure that your ask is fulfilled, and you want to keep telling your personal story to whoever will listen in this context, because it is really that will ultimately make the difference in terms of your success moving forward. And that's the presentation. That's the final slide.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ryan. I noticed we had a couple of questions come in here during the presentation, so if you want, I can just read them out to you and you can take a stab at them.
Sure.
All right, so we have one from Matthew here, and he was referring to the before the meeting slide. You mentioned a point about providing material that you want the decision maker to read ahead of time and keeping it brief, and he was asking if that was kind of referring to like a one-pager kind of thing.
That's exactly it. Yes, that's exactly it, Matthew. Yeah, one page. If you can fit everything on a page, that's ideal. You should always strive to be able to fit everything that you need that person to know, particularly in the context of a 30-minute meeting, on one page, ideally. Yes, for sure.
Okay, perfect. And then we had another one here from Nancy, and she asks, as an example, if your ask is around getting access to a medication, what could be the solution a representative offers for the response of there's an insufficient budget?
So, Nancy, that's a good question, and it's actually a very good example. So one of the things that we emphasize is that you can only ask the person that you're advocating to do what is within their power. so you would never ask a particular, well, unless it was a minister of health in some provinces, but you would never ask an elected representative at the provincial level to list a drug because they don't have the power to just unilaterally do that kind of thing. So so let's say, for example, you ask them to write a letter on your behalf to a drug plan manager or to the Minister of Health or whoever it may be under the circumstances. And in that meeting, as you said, you get, well, I could write the letter, but the truth is that there's a problem with funding and there's no money and all this kind of stuff. But that's not what you're there to talk about. You need to really sort of break it down into the roles and responsibilities there. You're there because you have an issue with the provincial government, for example. And you're there because they have an obligation to represent your interests to the provincial government. Whether or not they agree with your issue, whether or not they agree with your perspective, whether or not there's a lot of money or no money or whatever the circumstances are, is quite frankly irrelevant. The only issue is that you have a problem with the provincial government, or you have a request of the provincial government. They are your representative, and they are there to take forward your perspective, whether or not they agree with it. And so my response back to somebody who said that would simply be, I understand what you're saying, but I'm here because you're my provincial representative, and I need you to do this for me because you represent me at Queen's Park or in Victoria or wherever it may be. And so I need you to write this letter on my behalf. And that's really what the answer is. You don't want to get into a debate with them about the merits of the issue. Their perspective on the issue might be of some value, and it should be noted, and it might help you in terms of your broader work. But for that moment in time and that thing that you're asking them to do, it's not relevant. It's about what they're prepared to do on your behalf as they're supposed to.
Okay, and those two questions are the only ones that we've had come in so far. So maybe what I'll do at this point is turn things back over to Mona, and she can do our little, oh, you know what? One just came back in right now as I'm talking. So this one's from Norma, and she says, when the decision maker is occupied with a major news issue on the day you have the meeting with them, they're obviously very preoccupied and are having a hard time focusing on the issue you're trying to bring to the table. Could you suggest, or should you suggest meeting later, or try to bring them around that day?
That's a great question, Norma. I think you're probably best advised if somebody is clearly preoccupied and if somebody is clearly not focused, I would just maybe very quickly say, look, I can tell you're very busy, and unfortunately this has just probably turned out to not be a great day. So if you wouldn't mind, I would appreciate if we could reschedule. Number one, they would probably appreciate that more than anything because they're so busy with something else. So you freed up some of their time. Number two, you've demonstrated that you are engaged and that you are respectful of their time and that you can sense, obviously, that something's going on here and you're not just focused on yourself, but you are sensitive to their reality. And three, you've got a much better shot when you come back of getting them focused and being focused. And they'll remember the courtesy that you provided by giving them that option. And so I would, under those circumstances, those kind of what I'll call more extreme circumstances where it's just completely obvious that they're not here, even though they may physically be there, I would suggest that you reschedule and do it that way. You're probably not going to be able to bring them around. It'll be too difficult, and it's not worth it. It's just not worth trying, probably in most cases.
Yeah, we actually had a similar situation at CCSN once where Jackie was heading out west to do some meetings, and there was actually a death in the of one of the ministers out there, and she just canceled all the meetings. So I think it's kind of a similar situation where you want to be privy to those things going on. John said it would be useful under those circumstances to maybe leave behind some information as well, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And also to, if at all possible, to physically rebook the meeting while you're there. If you've made the effort to go down to the constituency office or wherever it may be, I would not only do them the courtesy of saying, look, I'm happy to come back, but could I work with your scheduler or whomever and rebook right now? And they'll probably say yes, again, because you've done them a courtesy, and they would probably extend that courtesy back to you. So don't just leave. Make sure that you leave with another meeting date in the books.
And then we have one that just came in from Anne, and she says, any advice to patient advocates who are dealing with government organizations who are not one person, such as an expert review committee making drug funding decisions? These folks don't speak with members of the public or accept feedback.
Yeah, that's a very different that's a very, very different challenge, and there are a number of different ways that we have tried to do that work. So first of all, you can always write to them. We describe this as kind of formal versus informal advocacy. Formal advocacy is, I sort of describe it in this context, is when an organization reaches out to you and says, a government organization, for example, says, we would like some patient input, or we would like to hear from you, or this kind of thing, or we're holding consultations or whatever, and then so you are formally invited to come and participate. But informal advocacy is when there's no invitation, nobody's asked you anything about your opinion or your perspective, but you nevertheless take the time to write to them and to make those views known. Now, whether somebody reads them or not, or how much weight they're going to be given is one thing, but certainly taking the opportunity to engage is one choice in writing. In terms of meeting with people, again, my perspective is you don't ask unless you don't get unless you ask. So you should always try. I know just in this context, very recently, I worked with a couple of patient organizations who went and had a meeting with the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, PCPA. PCPA has no mechanism right now to meet with anybody. There's no process. There's nothing. But these groups wrote them, they asked, and they got a meeting. And so I think the worst thing that anybody can say to you in these contexts is no. And so why not try? But you have to be realistic, and you have to be ready for the fact that a lot of these organizations, particularly on the bureaucratic side of government, are not going to be set up and not necessarily going to be receptive. But never, ever confuse that with politicians. Politicians, they have to meet with you on some level. I'm not saying you're entitled to meet with the Premier anytime you want, but I'm just saying they have to meet with people. It's part of their job, particularly at the local level. So you have a much greater entitlement, if I can put it that way, to those types of meetings than necessarily with government agencies and that kind of thing. But I still come back to what I said a moment ago, and you should try. Again, you should always try, I think.
Okay, she just followed up with, thank you, I've written, and sadly they do not respond. I will, however, follow up with a request to meet with them. The worst anyone can say is no, and then she says, thank you, I appreciate your perspective. And from Norma, we have, if two or more patient organizations have the same problem, is it a benefit to come to the table at the same time or together?
Yeah, that's a great question, Norma. And there's no sort of there's no clear answer on that one. So so the simple answer is depends on the circumstances. If the two organizations are really aligned and really united, and there's no fear that that you can be, either one of you can be co-opted by government, or you can be sort of split apart, and you represent a really sort of robust constituency that would matter to government, then yes, you should go together. It's a great idea. There is strength in numbers. There's no question. There's no question about it. The flip side of that, in addition to what I said a moment ago, which is this whole idea that if you can be sort of split apart, then you should probably stay apart, is this idea of one united loud voice versus a series of individual voices. Again, there is no right or wrong answer here. Sometimes it's about volume as it relates to one unified voice, and at other times in the work we do, it's about a series of individually loud voices making their views known, and creating what we call a critical mass of noise. So it's, oh, this group and this group and this group and this group kind of thing are able to do it. But on balance, I would say, I'm trying to answer your question. On balance, if the two groups do get along, everybody's connected, everybody's focused, and that kind of thing, you probably don't have much to lose by going in together, but make sure you really, really present a united front and make it clear that you almost want to make it seem like you are larger than the sum of your parts, kind of thing, and then you can usually get somewhere.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. That's our last question for now, and it looks like we're actually just about out of time too. So what I'll do now is turn it back over to Mona, who will send us off. And yeah, thanks, Ryan, and thanks everybody for listening today.
Hi, thank you. Today's webinar was presented by Ryan Clark of Advocacy Solutions. We had several
Everything
yeah,
good over
sorry,
there?
lost sound again, but that's fine now. Thank you. Thank you for attending our webinar. If you'd like to learn more about CCSN, visit our website, www.survivornet. Thank you, Ryan, for doing the webinar for us today. Your expertise and simple advice that is very well received and very useful to everybody. It's always appreciated. The webinar will be available online tomorrow, full video on YouTube, as well as slides on SlideShare. Everyone who's registered will get links to both sent out tomorrow afternoon. Thank you, Novartis, Merck, and Janssen for their generous support of this webinar series. Thank you all. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us today. Bye for now.